Hi students, and welcome to the video on how to write good sentences. This is basically an overview of the different sentence types and what makes a sentence, what qualifies as a sentence, all that good stuff. So I have the slideshow here. You can also see that the slideshow is on our course map. It's the PowerPoint. I'm going to view it as a slideshow. If you want to view the PowerPoint on your own at your own pace, I would do it as well so it looks the way it's supposed to look. So I'm just going to hit from start. So here we are talking about sentences. Hooray. So, what is a sentence? It sounds kind of like an obvious question, but we probably don't really even think about it. So, what is a sentence? Well, a sentence is a group of words that expresses a complete thought. See, thought, thinking. But that can be kind of hard to figure out. Okay, well, what is a complete thought? Because actually, something like it is could be considered a complete sentence because it's a complete thought, but it seems like it's not. It can be kind of tricky to figure out what a complete thought actually is. So, we're going to talk about that. Basically, sentences are made up of what we call clauses. Clause is just a fancy English word for a group of words. And it's important to know that there are two kinds of clauses. There are independent clauses, which have enough grammatical information on their own to be a sentence. So basically, an independent clause is enough words or information to be considered a sentence on its own. And then there's something called a dependent clause. Dependent clause does not have enough grammatical information on its own to be a sentence. So what does this mean? I'll tell you in a second. So that, however, is Santa Claus. He is a different kind of clause. Just want you to have that visual to remember the word clause. All right, so now we're going to move on. So how the heck do you know if a clause is independent or dependent? So it's really important to know how to distinguish these two because this is how you know whether or not you have a complete sentence. It's how you know sometimes whether you need a comma. It's how you know if you're putting together a correct sentence. So it's really important to know if a clause or a group of words is independent, basically if it's enough to be on its own or if it's dependent. So I'm going to give you a fancy test to use. You're going to put the group of words or the clause that you're trying to test into the following blank. If it makes sense, it's an independent clause. If it doesn't make sense, it's a dependent clause. So now I'm going to show you this blank you're going to put it into. They couldn't believe the idea that blank. So basically, if you have a group of words, say you're trying to figure out if a sentence is complete or not, if it has enough information, or if it could be considered a fragment. All you have to do is put it in this blank. If it makes sense, you're good. It's an independent clause. It could be a sentence on its own. If it doesn't, it's a dependent clause and it needs more information, or it needs an independent clause with it. So, kind of abstract right now. Let's try this. Let's test it out. Here's an example. I was inspired by the rain. It was raining. So let's test it out by placing it in the blank. So it seems kind of short, so you may think, is this really an independent clause? I'm not sure. Let's test it out. They couldn't believe the idea that, we're putting it in the blank, it was raining. That makes sense, right? Totally makes sense. I'm not left thinking like, what? I don't understand. They couldn't believe the idea that it was raining. Perfectly makes sense. That means, hooray, it's an independent clause because it makes sense. That's how I know it's an independent clause. So, therefore, it qualifies to be a sentence on its own. Let's try another one. Example 2. Whoever likes rainy weather. Okay, so this seems like, it's almost as many words as the other one, so maybe it could be its own, maybe it's an independent clause too. Let's try it out. Let's place it in our blank. They couldn't believe the idea that whoever likes rainy weather. Okay, that doesn't make sense, right? They couldn't believe the idea that whoever likes rainy weather. I'm left hanging. It doesn't make sense. It's not complete. That means, since it doesn't make sense, negative, it is not an independent clause. So because it doesn't make sense, I know it's not an independent clause, so it's got to be a dependent clause. It doesn't qualify to be a sentence on its own. Basically, a little side note, what this means is if you put this out on its own as a sentence, it's incorrect. It's what we call a sentence fragment. And I know that because I tested it in this blank and it didn't make sense. Let's go on. So, even if I do figure out that a clause is independent or dependent, what the heck do I do with it, right? What does this all mean? Basically, you can put different kinds of clauses together to form different kinds of sentences. If you've taken English 21 or 28, you've probably come across these terms in one form or another. I know you have if you were in the lab. So There's three kinds of sentences. There's simple sentences. Simple sentences consist of just one independent clause. A good example of that one would be that it was raining. Then we have compound sentences. Compound sentences consist of two or more independent clauses put together into a sentence. That would be something like, it was raining, comma, so I brought an umbrella. Two things that would both pass that test and are blank put together. And then there's a third kind of sentence, which is complex sentence. Complex, think of it this way. It's complex because it has two different kinds of things. One independent clause and one dependent clause. So basically, simple sentence mean it has one group of words that passes our test. They couldn't believe the idea that blank. Compound sentence means it has two different things that would pass our test that as independent clause. Complex sentence means it has one part that would pass the test as an independent clause and one part that would not pass our test as a dependent clause. What does this all mean? Basically, these are the kinds of ways you can put sentences together and have them be correct. You will note dependent clauses can't be alone in any type of sentence. There's no type of sentence in which it's okay to put a dependent clause by itself or a dependent clause with another dependent clause. You'll notice all these different kinds of sentences have in common is they have at least one independent clause. It's really important. You can't put a dependent clause by itself because that's a sentence fragment. So I can't have a sentence that's just whoever likes the rain because it's not enough information. It's not a complete sentence. All right? Hopefully you're following me. Let's keep going. So let's talk more about simple sentences. Maybe it's kind of seems abstract so far. We're going to make it a little more concrete with some specific examples. So simple sentences. We're keeping it simple. Think of it that way. Simple sentences tend to be on the shorter side. They tend to just have one subject and verb combination. So here's some examples of simple sentences. Chris enjoyed the movie. She danced all night. Jennifer likes horses. Megan runs track. These are all simple sentences. How do I know that they're simple sentences? Because they all would pass this test. They couldn't believe the idea that blank. They couldn't believe the idea that Chris enjoyed the movie. That makes sense. Passes the test. I know it's an independent clause. Independent clause is just another term for a simple sentence. Let's try number 2. She danced all night. They couldn't believe the idea that she danced all night. Makes sense? Now I know it's an independent clause. Simple sentence. They couldn't believe the idea that Jennifer likes horses. Makes sense? Passes the test. Independent clause. They couldn't believe the idea that Megan runs track. Makes sense? Passes the test. Independent clause. More on simple sentences now. So, each of these sentences passes our test in part because each one has the two things that are necessary in order to create a simple sentence or an independent clause. One subject and one verb. What's a subject? Subject just basically tells us who or what the sentence is about. So in the case of Jennifer likes horses, Jennifer's our subject, right? Because that's who or what the sentence is about. It also has one verb. The verb tells us what the subject is or what the subject is doing or being. So, for example, Jennifer likes horses. Our verb there would be likes because it's telling us what she's doing. Subject, verb. Nice little visual. Let's go on. So, let's test this out. What are the subjects in the sentences? Chris enjoyed the movie. She danced all night. Jennifer is a scientist. Megan runs track. You can even pause the video real quick and kind of figure it out on your own if you want. I'll give you a second to do that. All right, now we're going to keep going. So the subject is who or what the sentence is about. So in this case, our subjects are Chris, because that's who we're talking about. She danced all night. Jennifer is a scientist. And Megan runs track. You'll notice in these sentences, it's a proper name, right? We know exactly who they're talking about. A subject can also be what we call a pronoun. A pronoun is basically just kind of like a vague way of identifying someone. So rather than knowing this person's exact name, we call her she. Just like we could call Jennifer she, or we could call Chris he, right? So pronouns basically just like a noun or a name, but a little more vague. We don't know exactly who it is. That's just kind of a side note. All right, so these are the subjects in the sentence. What's the other part? I'm hoping you said verb out loud to yourself. Other part is the verb, right? Chris enjoyed the movie. She danced all night. Jennifer is a scientist. Megan runs track. You can even pause real quick and figure out the verbs on your own and then press play again and see if you're right. So let's see if you're right. Chris enjoyed the movie. Enjoyed is our verb, right? It's what he's doing or being. She danced all night. Dance is our verb because it's what she's doing. Jennifer is a scientist. Is our verb because in this case, it's not what she's doing, but it's what she's being. It's her state of being, right? So don't forget that is and are can be considered verbs as well. Like the backpacks are on the ground. Are would be our verb there. And then another obvious one, Megan runs track because running is what she's actually doing, right? Let's move on. Second kind of sentence, compound sentences. Now we're getting exciting, right? We're getting a little more complicated. This is a good visual to think of. Two pieces of Legos, this one's saying Lego, this guy's saying no. The reason why this is a good visual to go along with compound sentences is we have two things of equal importance or equal weight being put together in a compound sentence. Do you remember what I said a compound sentence was? Compound sentence is a sentence that combines two or more independent clauses. So two or more groups of words that could each stand on their own as an independent clause. Two or more. And there are two ways we can correctly put together independent clauses. So lots of times you'll see people just put two independent clauses together with no punctuation. That's incorrect. That's called a run-on. Other times we'll see them do it with just a comma. That's also incorrect. That is called a comma splice. I hope you said it out loud on your own. Yeah, so there are actually two ways we can do it and be correct. The first is with a semicolon, and the second is with a comma plus a FANBOYS word. You may be saying to yourself, what the heck is a FANBOYS word? Hopefully you've got some kind of introduction to this in your English 21 or 28 class or maybe in high school, but if not, let's review. What the heck is a FANBOYS word? FANBOYS words are basically words we can use with commas to combine two independent clauses. And they're called FANBOYS word because basically that is the little way we remember the words. If you write FANBOYS vertically, you can fill in what they are. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Those are our FANBOYS words, and they're just called FANBOYS because that's a way you can remember what they are. Also, you can think of this, FANBOYS. I don't know about you guys, but visuals really help me. So sometimes I just like to have little pictures I can think of to draw upon, what it is. So maybe these little visuals will help you. So basically, that's one way we can put together compound sentences. Here's an example of that. Grades are very important, comma, but there are some things that are more important. I have two independent clauses that are joined here with a comma with a FANBOYS word. This case, the FANBOYS word is but, right? Take special notice that the comma goes before the FANBOYS word. Another way I could do it is with a semicolon. Grades are very important, semicolon. However, comma, there are some things that are more important. Now this however isn't grammatically necessary. I could just say grades are very important. There are some things that are more important, but I think it's nice in terms of meaning. It's a nice transitional transitional word there. So when I use a transitional word after a semicolon, I need a comma. That's just a little side note. So remember this little thing? This is our little test, right? This is how I can make sure I know that I really have a compound sentence. I can put this part in the test and the part after, and they can both make sense. So they couldn't believe the idea that grades are very important. Makes perfect sense, right? That's how I know I got an independent clause here. Let's try the second part. They couldn't believe the idea that there are some things that are more important. Makes perfect sense. That's how I know I have a second independent clause here, right? That's how I know that I can join the two together with a comma and a but, because but is one of the FANBOYS words. Same things here. Because I know each one of these parts can stand on its own. It's an independent clause. It passes this test, and I can join them together with a semicolon, and if I choose to, another transitional word other than a FANBOYS word. Okay? So, let us go on. Complex sentences. So we've gone through simple sentences. Just a reminder, simple sentences are one independent clause. We've gone through compound sentences. Compound sentences are two independent clauses put together. And now we're going to talk about complex sentences. And like I mentioned before, I love this visual. Complex sentences are complex because we're putting two different kinds of things together. One independent clause, think of Arnold Schwarzenegger. One dependent clause, a little guy who can't be on his own. Think of Danny DeVito. I don't know if any of you guys are old enough to remember this movie Twins, but it is hilarious. And this is a really good visual for what a complex sentence is, because we got one thing that can stand on its own and one thing that can't, but we can put them together into the same sentence and it makes it complex because we got more than one kind of thing going on here. Let's keep going. So remember, a complex sentence is a sentence that is made up of one independent clause and one dependent clause. So here's an example of the independent clause that could stand on its own. Mary went to the store. Here's an example of a dependent clause, because she wanted to buy a purse. How do I know that one's independent and one's dependent? I can use my little test, right? They couldn't believe the idea that Mary went to the store. That makes sense. Therefore, I know it's an independent clause. Let's test this other one. They couldn't believe the idea that because she wanted to buy a purse. That does not make sense. That is how I know this is not an independent clause, rather it's a dependent clause, and that's how I know I can only use this one if I put it together with one that does pass a test. Basically, the dependent clause, it's too weak to stand on its own. It needs something to go with it. It needs this independent clause to go with it. And when I put them together, it forms a complex sentence. Mary went to the store because she wanted to buy a purse. Make sense? Let's go on. So, which of these is an independent clause? I'll give you a second. Maybe you want to even pause it. How can you test it out? Oh, I know. You could use my little test. They couldn't believe the idea of that blank. You put each one of them into it, and I'll let you guys think about it for a second, and then you tell me which one is the independent clause. You can even pause it. The answer is, we will go tomorrow, right? They couldn't believe the idea that we will go tomorrow. That's the only one that makes sense. Other ones, they couldn't believe the idea that every other day. That doesn't make sense. All the other ones don't make sense. That's how we know we will go tomorrow is the only one that makes sense, so it's the only one that's an independent clause. It's also the only one that feels like a complete idea. What about a dependent clause? Which one of these is a dependent clause? Try our little test. You can even pause it right now and figure it out. And I'm going to give you the answer now. Spoiler alert. So the answer is because we're having a party. So in this case, we know it's the only one that doesn't make sense when we put it in the blank. They couldn't believe the idea that because we were having a party. Once again, that doesn't make sense. That's how I know that's the dependent clause, because the other ones actually make sense. So, quickly, how do you know if you need a comma in your complex sentence? Because sometimes you need a comma in a complex sentence and sometimes you don't. It's a little tricky. I will tell you how. Generally, you only need a comma if the dependent clause comes first. So here's an example. Because I missed the bus, comma, I was late. I need that comma there because my dependent clause or my incomplete thought here is coming first. That's why I need a comma. I was late because I missed the bus. So in this case, I just flipped the order. This time, do I need a comma? No, I don't. I don't need a comma because my dependent clause was second. So I only need a comma in a complex sentence when the dependent clause is first. Let's review. Little rewind, right? Which of these is a simple sentence? You can even pause it. Spoiler alert, once again, I'm going to tell you. Kyle and Mike went fishing is our simple sentence because we only have one independent clause here. And remember, a simple sentence consists of only one independent clause. Which of these is a compound sentence? I'm going to tell you. All right, the compound sentence is the second one, right? How do I know? I know because I have one independent clause that would pass my test. I have a second independent clause that would pass my test, and they're combined with a comma with the FANBOYS word. And lastly, which one's a complex sentence? Process of elimination, you probably could figure out. It's number 3. I know that because I have one piece that is a dependent clause, could not stand on its own, and I have one piece that is an independent clause that could stand on its own. And I have a comma here because I began with my dependent clause. All right, hope this helps. You can watch it 20 times, it'll be super fun. And you can also look at the slideshow at your own pace too, okay? And this will help you write better sentences.